Man finds lion cub dying on road, rescues it, and then 3 lions do something unbelievable. The scorching African sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty tarmac as Dr. James Mitchell drove through Kruger National Park, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel of his dusty Land Rover. After 23 years working as a wildlife veterinarian in South Africa, he thought he'd seen everything the savannah could throw at him. He was wrong. What he discovered that sweltering afternoon would challenge everything he believed about the bond between humans and wild animals, and reveal a truth so profound it would haunt him for the rest of his life. The road stretched endlessly ahead, shimmering in the heat haze like a mirage. James had been driving for 3 hours, returning from a research station deep in the park where he'd been treating an injured rhinoceros. His shirt stuck to his back with sweat, and his mind wandered to the cold beer waiting in his refrigerator back in Nelspruit. That's when he saw it, a small, tawny shape lying motionless in the middle of the road. At first, he thought it was roadkill, another victim of the increasing traffic through the park. But as he slowed his vehicle and drew closer, his trained eye caught something that made his heart skip a beat. The shape was breathing, barely perceptible rises and falls of a tiny ribcage fighting against the inevitable. James pulled over and stepped out into the oppressive heat. The silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of his cooling engine and the distant call of a fish eagle. As he approached, he could see it clearly now. A lion cub, no more than 8 weeks old, lying on its side with its eyes barely open, panting rapidly in the scorching sun. The cub was severely dehydrated, its golden fur matted and dull. Small flies buzzed around its nose and mouth, and James could see the telltale signs of heat exhaustion. Without immediate intervention, the animal would be dead within the hour. "Jesus," he whispered, dropping to his knees beside the cub. His veterinary instincts kicked in immediately, overriding any concerns about approaching a wild predator. He gently lifted the small body, it weighed no more than 5 pounds, and felt the rapid, thready pulse beneath the soft fur. But even as he cradled the dying cub, a chill ran down his spine despite the blazing heat. Somewhere in the distance, carried on the hot wind, came a sound that made every hair on his arms stand up. The deep, resonant roar of an adult lion. Then another, and another. James glanced around nervously. Lion cubs didn't survive alone in the wild. If this little one was here, abandoned and dying, there was a story behind it. And judging by those roars growing closer, that story wasn't over yet. He made a decision that would change his life forever. Racing back to his Land Rover, James grabbed his emergency veterinary kit from the back seat. He always traveled with basic supplies, IV fluids, syringes, medications, never knowing when he might encounter an animal in distress. But treating a lion cub on the side of a road, with its family potentially nearby, was far outside his normal protocols. Working quickly, he administered a small dose of saline solution subcutaneously, just enough to begin addressing the dehydration without overwhelming the cub's tiny system. The animal barely responded to the injection, its breathing remaining shallow and labored. Come on, little one," James murmured, wrapping the cub in a blanket from his truck. "Stay with me." As he worked, the roaring grew louder, more urgent. James estimated the sounds were coming from perhaps half a mile away, but in the open savannah, sound could be deceiving. Lions could cover that distance in minutes if they chose to. He faced an impossible choice. Park regulations strictly prohibited removing any animal from the wild, even for medical treatment. The proper protocol would be to contact the park authorities and wait for an official response. But the cub would be dead long before help arrived, and James couldn't live with watching a helpless animal die when he had the skills to save it. His decision made, James carefully placed the cub in a ventilated box in the back of his Land Rover and began the 40-minute drive to his private clinic in Nelspruit. Behind him, the roaring continued, growing more distant but never fully fading away. The next 72 hours blurred together in a haze of sleepless vigilance. James converted a room in his clinic into a makeshift nursery, maintaining the cub's body temperature with heat lamps while administering IV fluids and nutritional supplements around the clock. He slept in 2-hour intervals, waking to check vital signs and adjust treatment protocols. The cub, which James had begun calling Kessie, meaning born in troubled times, slowly responded to treatment. On the second day, she managed to lift her head and take small amounts of milk formula from a bottle. By the third day, she was attempting to stand on unsteady legs, her amber eyes finally showing sparks of alertness. But even as Kessie grew stronger, James grappled with a growing dilemma. He had saved her life, but what kind of life could she have now? She was too young to survive in the wild alone, yet keeping a lion in captivity would mean a lifetime of confinement. Rehabilitation programs existed, but they were expensive, time-consuming, and offered no guarantee of successful reintegration. More troubling still were the dreams that had begun haunting his nights. In them, he stood on that dusty road again, but this time he could see 3 adult lions in the distance, pacing back and forth, their roars carrying a heartbreaking note of loss and longing. He would wake with tears on his cheeks, wondering if he had saved one life only to destroy others. On the 4th morning, James made another decision that defied both logic and regulation. If Kessie was to have any chance at a normal life, she needed to be returned to her family. The question was whether they would still accept her, or whether his human scent would mark her as an outsider forever. Loading Kessie back into the transport box, James drove once again through the park gates. He had called in favors with park officials, spinning a story about tracking collar research that would give him legitimate access to the areas where he'd found her. But the truth was simpler and more personal. He needed to make this right. The journey back to that stretch of road took on an almost pilgrimage-like quality. James found himself talking to Kessie, explaining what he was trying to do, as if the month-old cub could understand the gravity of the situation. "Your family is out there somewhere," he said softly as the familiar landscape rolled past. "They're probably still looking for you. Lions have better memories than people give them credit for." As they approached the location where he'd found her, James slowed the Land Rover and began scanning the surrounding terrain. The grassland stretched away on both sides of the road, dotted with acacia trees that provided islands of shade in the vast golden sea. At first, he saw nothing but the usual park wildlife, zebras grazing in the distance, a secretary bird stalking through the grass, vultures circling high overhead. Then he saw them. 3 lions rested beneath a large marula tree about 200 yards from the road. Even at a distance, James could see they were a female and 2 juveniles, probably 18 months old. The female's head was raised, watching his vehicle with the intense focus that predators reserved for potential threats or prey. James parked the Land Rover and sat quietly, studying the lions through binoculars. The female was lean but healthy, her coat the rich gold of mature lionesses. The 2 juveniles bore enough resemblance to suggest they were her offspring from a previous litter. More importantly, all 3 animals showed signs of stress, constant pacing, frequent scent marking, and a restlessness that spoke of deep anxiety. These were the voices he had heard roaring 4 days ago. This was Kessie's family. Taking a deep breath, James made perhaps the most dangerous decision of his career. He opened the transport box and gently lifted out Kessie, who had grown noticeably stronger during her recovery. She weighed nearly 8 pounds now, her fur glossy and her eyes bright with curiosity about the familiar scents and sounds of her homeland. "This is it, little one," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Time to go home." But rather than simply placing her on the ground and driving away, James did something unprecedented. He walked slowly toward the 3 lions, carrying Kessie in his arms, speaking in low, calming tones. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but some deeper intuition told him this was the only way. The lioness stood as he approached, her muscles tensed for action. The juveniles flanked her, forming a protective triangle. James stopped at 50 yards, close enough for them to see and scent Casey, far enough to avoid triggering an immediate attack. What happened next would replay in James's memory for the rest of his life. The lioness took a single step forward, then stopped. Her nostrils flared as she caught Casey's scent, mixed with the foreign smells of human contact and medical treatment. For a long moment, the adult lions remained motionless, as if processing information that didn't fit their understanding of the world. Then Casey mewed. It was a small sound, barely audible over the whisper of wind through grass, but its effect on the three lions was electric. The lioness's ears snapped forward, and she took another step, then another. Behind her, the juveniles began to pace excitedly, their tails switching with nervous energy. James knelt and gently placed Casey on the ground, between himself and her family. The cub, still weak but determined, began walking unsteadily toward the lioness, on legs that trembled with effort and excitement. The reunion that followed challenged everything James thought he knew about wild animal behavior. The lioness approached slowly, every line of her body expressing caution warring with desperate hope. When she reached Casey, she lowered her massive head and began sniffing the cub thoroughly, paying particular attention to scent glands behind her ears and at the base of her tail. James held his breath, knowing that if the lioness rejected Casey due to human contamination, the consequences would be immediate and brutal. Instead, after what felt like an eternity, the lioness began to groom Casey with her rough tongue, the same way she would clean her own young. The cub responded by pressing against her, purring with a sound that was both heartbreaking and joyful. But the most remarkable moment was yet to come. As the lioness continued her examination of Casey, she periodically raised her head to look directly at James, not with the predatory focus of a hunter evaluating prey, but with what he could only describe as acknowledgement. Her golden eyes held an intelligence and awareness that seemed to understand exactly what had happened, that this strange, hairless creature had saved her child and brought her home. The two juveniles, overcome with excitement at their siblings' return, began play-fighting around the reunited pair, their earlier anxiety replaced with feline joy. But the lioness remained still, her gaze fixed on James with an expression that transcended species barriers. Then she did something that no wildlife textbook had ever described, something that James would struggle to convince his colleagues had actually happened. The lioness stood and walked toward him. James remained perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs. Every survival instinct told him to run, but something deeper, perhaps the same intuition that had guided him this far, kept him rooted in place. The lioness approached to within 10 feet, close enough that he could see the individual whiskers on her muzzle and smell the wild scent of the African bush on her fur. She sat down. For nearly 5 minutes, woman and man regarded each other in silence. James felt as though he was being evaluated by an intelligence ancient and profound, a consciousness that had existed in these lands for millions of years before humans arrived. He sensed no threat, only a communication that transcended words or conventional understanding. Finally, the lioness stood, walked back to her cubs, and began leading them away from the road toward the deeper bush. But she paused once more, looking back at James with what he could only interpret as gratitude. As the lion family disappeared into the golden grassland, James remained, kneeling on the dusty ground, tears streaming down his face. He had witnessed something that challenged the conventional wisdom about human-animal relationships, something that suggested the emotional lives of wild creatures were far more complex than science had yet acknowledged. The drive back to Nelsprout passed in a blur of emotion and reflection. James knew he would never be able to adequately describe what had happened to his colleagues or friends. The scientific community would demand proof he didn't have, evidence that couldn't be captured in photographs or data, but the experience had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. Over the following months, James found himself returning to that stretch of road whenever his work brought him through the area. He never saw Kesey and her family again, but park rangers reported increased lion activity in the region, including sightings of a healthy female with 3 cubs of various ages. The knowledge that his impossible decision had restored a family gave James a peace he had never known in his decades of wildlife work. The experience also changed his approach to conservation. He began advocating for more nuanced policies that recognized the complex emotional lives of wildlife, arguing that rigid adherence to non-intervention protocols sometimes caused more harm than good. His colleagues initially dismissed these ideas as anthropomorphism, but James's reputation for scientific rigor eventually lent weight to his arguments. Years later, as James approached retirement, he would often tell the story of Kesey to young veterinarians and conservationists. Most listened politely but skeptically, filing it away as the kind of embellished tale that accumulated around long careers in wildlife management. But a few, those with their own inexplicable experiences in the field, understood that the natural world still held mysteries that science had not yet learned to measure. The photograph on James's desk, taken by a passing tourist on that remarkable afternoon, showed a man kneeling in the African dust while 3 lions watched from beneath a distant tree. To most observers, it appeared to be simply another wildlife encounter in one of the world's great parks. But to James, it captured the moment when he learned that the line between human and animal, between civilization and wilderness, was far more permeable than he had ever imagined. The bond forged on that dusty road between a dying cub and the man who saved her had created ripples that extended far beyond a single act of rescue. It had revealed a truth about the interconnectedness of all life that would guide James's work and worldview for the rest of his days. Sometimes, he reflected, the greatest discoveries came not from laboratory research or field studies, but from the courage to trust in the mysterious wisdom that connected all living things. In the end, Kesey had taught him that love, in its purest, most elemental form, recognized no boundaries of species or circumstance. And in learning that lesson, James had discovered that the real miracle wasn't that he had saved a lion cub's life, but that in doing so, he had found a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to be alive in this remarkable world.